Welcome everyone to the second episode of the podcast. We've got once again a very special guest. Hi, Kedric. How's it going?
Hey Sam, things are good. Thanks for having me on. It's good to be one of the first few people. I feel honored to be a part of the podcast.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think my first question is always going to be this: can you tell us a little bit about what Kedric was like before powerlifting came into his life?
Yeah, I would probably say, take a little trip down memory lane. So right now, I'm on a good day, close to 5'11". Uh, you know, and you know, back then before I started lifting, I weigh roughly 85 kilos now, right? So if people have seen me in person, they have a context of what my size looked like in relation to my height. But back then, before I started lifting, I was probably 5'8", so maybe 2 inches shorter, right? But I was like 58 kilos, so almost a whole 30 kilos less. So I was like this really like lanky, I would say tall, for an Asian, because I grew up in Malaysia. In fact, I only moved to New Zealand in the slightly more than half a decade ago, so like 6-7 years ago. But prior to that, I lived most of my life in New Zealand. I did a short couple of months in Australia, and I also studied in London for 1.5 years. But yeah, before I started powerlifting, I was like this really tall, skinny like kid that quite a mediocre athlete. But I wanted to like have an edge, right? Have an edge on my other like teammates. So I played volleyball, but in the team, despite being one of the taller ones, my coordination wasn't the best. And this so when I was playing like a hitter in volleyball, and what I wanted to do was try to get like more vertical jump, right? So I started looking how can I jump higher, and what I did was basically stumbled upon resources that said, oh, cool, you want to jump higher, you need to do a combination of like plyometrics and strength work, right? So, contrary to a lot of teenage boys experience where they go to the gym and start pumping bench press, right? I went in and started doing squats first. That was kind of like my introduction to lifting. I just wanted to be better at volleyball. And then slowly I started putting on like muscle mass and people started asking me, hey, we see your physique changing slightly, right? What is there any what have you been doing? And being someone who is quite curious, all right, when I don't know the answers, I'll just like look up, back in the days with like forums like bodybuilding.com, all that kind of stuff, muscle and fitness forums, right? I just look at all of that, and then I try to give an answer to my friends if I don't have an answer at the moment. So that's kind of like how I started in the whole like fitness industry, right? So yeah, and then before that, I was never really like, cool, let's do powerlifting, right? But the fact of the matter is that because I squat, right, and then my legs were relatively stronger, and I also have a wingspan. So I just said that on a good day, I'm like 5'10", but my wingspan, so the length of my arms is 6 foot. So I'm longer than I am tall, I would say, right? For my wingspan is longer than my height. So because of that, my legs were decently strong. I could deadlift because I have lesser range of motion. And people will be like, oh yeah, there's a sport where they use if you have a big deadlift, it helps, and that's powerlifting, right? My bench is still horrendously bad because of my long arms. But yeah, that's kind of like how I stumbled into powerlifting as a powerlifter, right? Not so much on the haven't really talked much about the coaching side, but that's kind of like the origin story.
Very interesting, because basically it's exactly my story, except for the fact that it was basketball and not volleyball. But like the vertical sprinting, the fact that it was extremely underweight, the long arms, the fact that my bench press sucks as well. So like exactly the same story. So yeah, that's fun. And yeah, so volleyball was the only sport that you played apart from powerlifting?
No, I actually played a lot of sports.
Okay.
So I played handball, volleyball, and football. Football,
Okay.
like football, not American football.
Okay, so you mean soccer. Okay. Yeah. Nice. Okay. Is it popular over there?
Yeah, it's actually the biggest. It is actually one of the biggest sports growing up in Malaysia.
Okay. I didn't know this. Okay. So and I'm curious about this. Over the course of, you know, all of your career in those other sports as well, um, is there a coach or you know, like a figure in general that has shaped your thinking significantly?
Yeah, I think it's a good segue because we mentioned football, right? And I'm a long-time loyal Arsenal fan. For those people that out there who knows the reference, you know the Arsenal fan. We are quite loyal, right? So let's see if our loyalty pays off this season. Two more matches to go. We shall see. So I think that because of that, like I would say that a coach that shaped my thinking is actually Arsène Wenger, right? He was like one of the longest. Yeah, he is the longest serving Arsenal manager, right? One of the longest serving managers in English Premier League. And he really like transformed the whole scene, right, of English Premier League, with a slightly more like methodical and scientific approach, right? Also slightly like a more long-term game, right? Long-term mindset rather than, we have all the money in the world like Manchester City and we just buy a whole team, right? Whereas Arsene Wenger had that like, oh, we take somebody from the academy from the at a young age and then we grow them into the player that they want to. We groom them into the player to fit our club's philosophy. And one big thing as well is that he started like revolutionizing like nutrition for the Premier League players. Uh, Having slightly more nutritious food rather than just eating like pub grub, which is very popular in in the UK. You just get like pub lunches, and all that. Focusing on how to fuel the athlete, right, and how to recover from it. And one big thing as well was like just the mindset, right? Like people always say back in the day, right? Arsenal played really beautiful football, right? Even though and I think that the only reason why Arsenal fans are still Arsenal fans, even though we haven't won anything in a long time, is because we play beautiful football. Like the passes, the tiki taka, and all that is like really good to watch. And the thing is that Arsene Wenger is very adaptable. He has a lot of different tactics. He's not like saying, oh, we always have to play 4-4-2, right? There are times when he will play like 4-5-1. Then sometimes he'll play 3-5, and I can't remember the exact formation, but he will shift his formation based on the game, and it's never be like, okay, we always have to play this 4-4-2. And depending on the players that he has, sometimes you shift the game. For example, when Cesc Fabregas went into Arsenal, right? The style shifted to accommodate Fabregas' playing style because he was like one of the star players back then, right? Things like that. So I think that really taught like the importance of the adaptability of Wenger, right, and how he revolutionized the Premier League. So I guess like that, it's kind of that is a coach that I kind of like admire as well because I think that when it comes to team sports, there's a lot of like tradition involved because you're working with when you work with a team, there's always like, we have this tradition, right? We have this we have to do, right? And you're not just working with the players, right? You're working with like the management of the team, right? You come in as a new manager, right? You have to manage your staff, you have to manage the players, you're accountable to your shareholders, right? And one thing that a very clear example was obviously this season where Manchester United sacked Ruben Amorim after a while, but people just say that they tried to fit Ruben Amorim in. They basically hired him to play how they want him to play, but he his style was not like that, so obviously that itself had some like headbutting, right? But I think like Wenger did really well, right? And he like transformed football with all that, and I don't think it's really surprising that I do a lot of nutrition work, and Wenger obviously inspired the nutrition revolution in the Premier League as well. So you can say that, and football is the only sport I watch now besides powerlifting, and football would always remain like a sport that that like football will always be here, right? No matter how much I work in powerlifting, I don't think powerlifting would like overtake my love for football. So, yeah.
Yeah, sounds good. I mean, also, there's a component of, I would say, fun and enjoyment that is a bit more absent in powerlifting, because it's like it can be fun, but it's different, right? Whereas in sports like basketball or football, it's different. It's a team sport. You can have a lot of fun while playing, while watching a game. In powerlifting, it's a bit different, I would say. There's also that component as well.
Yeah, for sure. I'm, at heart, I'm a big like fan of like team sports. So even when I see like, on Instagram when like, Druins post like team Great Britain training together, or like the Dutch Powerlifting Federation have like team training, a lot of that like it appeals to me a lot. I like the team environment. I know that some people really like uh, you know, uh, individual sport, right? But now, people are more and more gravitating towards like powerlifting is more like a team sport, because you have like different coaches that has different roles and responsibilities, and I think that really appeals to me quite a fair bit, right? Like the team environment. So I've always been a massive team sport person.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's interesting that, of course, with powerlifting growing as a sport, we're starting to see also, for example, the concept of staff of an athlete evolve a little bit, right? Because now, at some competitions, you've even got the sports psychologist, for example, right? For some athletes. So that's going to be interesting to watch in the next years, because like, I can see a future where you've got the programming coach, maybe a game day coach that helps you out, the sports psychologist, the physio, even the data analyst at some point, right? That depends a lot on how the sport evolves in terms of money, but like, of course, that's something that in richer sports is always present at the game, right? So the coach makes life decisions also based on what the data analysts say. So that's going to be interesting to watch. I don't know what you think about this.
Yeah, I think funding is definitely a massive part, right, of things. When I was doing my masters in the UK, I did an internship with Cardiff City Football Club. So Cardiff City, if I'm not mistaken, they're actually being promoted to the Premier League the next season. They always were like in between Premier League and the Championship, which is like one tier below. But when I did there, I was actually like the official. I was an intern, but I was like the official sports nutritionist, because Cardiff City never had a nutritionist because they lack funding, right? So it also is kind of there is a certain culture as well, right? Maybe like I said, when Wenger came, right? He and revolutionized the nutrition component, but there are certain clubs that might not see the importance of nutrition, right? They might hire like 5 SNC coaches, but not even one nutritionist. And I think that powerlifting at the start as well was kind of like that, right? We hire the programming coach first, right? We always get the programming coach because to a certain extent you make a lot of your gains from the training aspect of things. But then people started realizing the component of weight cutting, right? So they want to hire somebody that can do weight cuts. And then I've always been really surprised that people now are actually hiring nutritionists, including myself, right? When people come want and express interest to work with me, and they say their goal is to gain mass, I'm like, you're hiring me to gain weight? Like most people come to me when they want to cut weight, right? So that isn't too surprising. But now people are starting to play to see a greater importance, and I think that when resources increase, whether through funding or whatever other means, maybe some rich trust fund trust fund baby just likes powerlifting and decides to put a lot of money in it, people will start investing in other avenues, right? Like there are always tiers of things, right? You have like, you get the programming coach, right? You get that first, you get your nutritionist, right? Those two elements are done. Then now you have like the sports side, right? You hire the sports psychologist, even like sports sites for powerlifting now is starting to grow, right? So there are all those elements, right? The only thing that is kind of like holding powerlifting back right now is still that powerlifting is actually it's still pretty much an expensive hobby. I think that in terms of financial investment, people actually invest more money into powerlifting than they get from it. So until that there is some form of resource that actually flip the scales where lifters can actually live like athletes earning money, right? I think that there will be a bottleneck somehow or other. So, but I think it's interesting to see where what the future would hold in that regards.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Yeah, and I guess you saw Susie's and Matt's podcast about this specific aspect, right, of funding, and yeah, like what they said is interesting. Like back then, it was even worse, of course, right? Now it's improving, and we've got to be grateful for that, and at the same time, I think we can be optimistic about it because we're starting to see certain athletes who manage to uh, you know uh, do powerlifting almost as a full-time job, or at least with a side job that is not too invasive, right? So yeah, and of course that's gonna affect performances in a very positive way as well.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, which leads me to my next question. When So, of course, you've had a pretty long and successful career as a coach, and you've had a chance to coach um, both the intermediate, the elite, the extremely elite as well. And I would be interested in knowing what you think about this. Let's say that I give you a few variables, right? Um, I would like you to assign, sort of like a percentage in terms of importance to each of those so that they add up to 100, ideally, in relation to the extent to which they contribute to success. So, we start with the obvious ones. So, genetics, programming, technique, and then there's lifestyle, which we were talking about, the coach to athlete relationship, and the psychological traits of the athlete, I would say. So there's both the more, let's say, individual/technical stuff like programming, genetics, technique, and the more, let's say, social sciences stuff, right? So the coach to athlete relationship, the psychological traits of the athlete, the lifestyle. So what do you think about it?
Yeah, I think that it's a good question. So there are 6 variables, and if if someone has no idea, right, on any of these variables and how it contributes, I think that the fair way to do things is to assign each variable at equal amount of percentage, right? Let's say you don't know anything about the sport, and you don't have, you're basically clueless, right? So that means if you have 6 variables, you divide that 100% by 6. That's roughly 16.63%. Right. So that it means that every single variable contributes equally. But if I were to flip that, what I would do is that I would say genetics would contribute at minimum 33%, which is basically double the contribution of if I were to evenly distribute everything. So I think genetics plays the biggest factor. It's not really surprising, right, when we talk about ourselves just now, that we are not really built for powerlifting. We are a little bit too tall, arms a little bit too long, and for us, especially when we do pack on muscle mass, we probably get we can pack on a little bit, like we do get a bit fatter as well, right? That we don't. There are some people that can just pack on muscle mass, like every like kilo they gain is just muscle,
Yeah,
so it
we're
could be
not Will Bolt.
a whole. Yeah. So I think genetics plays the biggest role. So I'll probably assign it a 33% value. So basically 1/3 of the factors would come from genetics. The next thing I would assign would probably be psychology, would probably be around 20%. So just slightly more than if everything were to be equal, so 20%. And the reason I mean this might be also a little bit of a like cheating as well, because I also think psychological and personality traits are heritable as well from genetics, right? So we've seen like things like conscientiousness, things like this can be heritable as well. So I would say that psychology plays a bigger role, right? And we actually see that there are certain personality traits that are present that in elite athletes, right? So things like low neuroticism, right? Higher conscientiousness, right? This would be traits that are important because essentially it is decision. It governs decision making process. So that helps as well. So I would probably assign that 20%. So the combination of genetics plus psychology is the 53%. So it really like pushes things halfway through. So that's kind of like why I assign that value, meaning that half of the slightly more a simple majority of things is probably certain traits, right? Then the next one would be like your recovery and your lifestyle. So I would probably classify that as your environment. So I would probably put that as 17%. 16 point. I'll just put 16.3, just round it up, right, to 17%. So I would say that genetics matter, right? So I always think of it as like genetics loads the gun, right? And the environment or like the lifestyle fires it, right? So you need ideal environment that is conducive towards your training goals, in this sense powerlifting, right? So maybe a gym, right, that has calibrated plates is probably better than a gym that, if you train with bumper plates. That's an example, right? I mean, if you're really really strong and the only access you have is bumper plates, your strength will be maxed out by how much you can load on the bar. That's an example. A very very simple example. Obviously socio-economic status as well matters. I think that there's a study where they actually showed that they were looking at sort of like different ethnic groups, right? And strength and hand grip strength, and what they found was that certain ethnic groups were stronger only when socioeconomic status were equated for, right? So if socioeconomic status is lower in this ethnic group, right, they are actually their hand grip strength is slightly lower than their counterparts. So that also shows there's an environmental factor that plays a role in it. And obviously all this is like, and also the reason why I place this under psychology is I think that people with a good psychological state, like say high conscientiousness and low neuroticism, would be able to craft a lifestyle that is conducive for them, right? So that's kind of like why I would place it that way. So far we have 70% already, right? So genetics 33, psychology 20, that's 53, plus 17, that's 70%. So that's a big chunk. A big chunk of the success will come from these three main factors. And then I look at programming, or we call it periodization. I will assign it 15%, roughly 15%. And I just base this on, I think that there are meta-analysis showing that periodized training gives, modestly better gains, slightly around like a moderate effect size, around 0.35 to 0.45, than non-periodized program. So slightly moderate effect size, I'll put that as 15%. And I think one thing to keep in mind as well, the way I am ranking this is not from the perspective of like, it's more from the perspective is that if like trying to control for certain factors, someone who has bigger genetics without a periodized program versus someone who is weaker genetics with a periodized program, who would be better? I would say the person that has better genetics. I think that the only steroid study that we have showed that people who take steroids can literally not lift weights and still grow more muscle than some people who like are training naturally. So so that's an example of why I say that certain genetics factor may actually be more favorable as long as your resistance training. So the periodized program, with your effect size being that small, I think that it ranks slightly lower than all the factors I've mentioned above. Then for the coach-athlete relationship, I'll put it at 10%. So I think that there's a meta-analysis by Fisher and colleagues showing that a small to moderate effect size, so just under like 0.3 to 0.4. So if I rank periodization at 15%, effect size that's smaller, I'll probably put at 10%. And that's what that actually showed. They rank it from the perspective of supervised training. So it's not coach-athlete relationship in the powerlifting sense, but I think that the closest we get is supervised training, because technically your coach-athlete relationship allows you to facilitate the training process, which I would say is pretty similar to supervised training. And then when you add all of that up, what is left is basically 5% left, and I'll give 5% to technique, because technique is so variable for individual to individual. I would not say that if I were to put it as a causal factor, I'll rank it really low, because to say it ranks high on the causal factor, it means that this particular technique has to cause gains in training. But the fact of the matter is that because the technique is so variable from individual to individual, I would rank that like it's actually quite the opposite. And in fact, certain studies actually show that powerlifters have specific adaptation where they are lacking certain range of motion and they are stiffer in that position, And people might say, well, they have to be more flexible in that position, but maybe it's actually an adaptation that allows them to lift more weights in that specific position because they are stiffer, which obviously limits their function in other movement that probably requires the opposite range of motion. So I'll say that technique is really low, because most of the time, whatever you do, provided you're not doing something absolutely ridiculous that would put you in the hospital, you would adapt to that technique slowly, and over time you would get better at what you're doing. So that's the lowest on my list, 5%. Yeah, and so that's that's basically what I think, right? So genetics 33%, psychology 20%, environment, lifestyle 17%, programming 15%, coach-athlete relationship 10%, and technique 5%.
Yeah, pretty interesting. I think it's gonna be very fun to see how certain Italians will react to these 5% technique, because also Jason said pretty much the same. And it's interesting, right? Because in Italy we've got these school of thought that like it's one of the main schools that revolves heavily around technique. I'm pretty sure that some people I know would say that technique is probably top 3, maybe after genetics, something like that. So this is very interesting. So like when it comes to technique, it looks like you have more of a bottom-up approach rather than a top-down. That is, I was talking about this with Jason, like certain people have an idea in their mind about how a squat is supposed to look like, how a bench is supposed to look like. And then they try to drive the athlete towards the idea by giving certain inputs, with constant analysis of their videos and so on. Whereas other people tend to have a more, I would say a more, bottom-up view, whereby it's like the body does its thing and, it kind of self-organizes. You just need to give a few inputs and then the body does its thing. So it looks like, correct me if I'm wrong, you're closer to the second opinion.
Are you talking about just like programming in general or technique in general?
Technique. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that for technique, definitely a little bit more bottom up. Yeah, I would say, I lean more bottom up, for technique, just because of how different individuals are.
Interesting. Yeah. And like, have you ever observed situations where like a even a like a modest change in technique would lead to much better results in the following like weeks and months, and would unlock something in a kind of non-linear way. That is, everything is going in one direction. There's a technique change, and things start like taking a completely different turn in a positive way.
Yeah, I think a lot of that is kind of like they want to be like the technique should allow them to feel confident. It should be something that allows confidence to be repeated over time. And I think that that's the most important, right? The reason why I do think that the bottom up approach sits a little bit better with me when it comes to technique is just due to the fact that how the athlete's body organize itself is something that they are probably comfortable with doing over and over again. That's why they get into that position, right? It's like kind of like their default homeostatic state. I'm not saying that everything default is right, but I'm saying that if you can make changes that doesn't deviate too greatly from what their current state is, the likelihood of them adopting it will be much higher, right? So that is probably the thing that I would say is that the technique change shouldn't be so huge, right? And the fact of the matter is also that this has to be observed under load, right? So they might feel really good doing it with the empty barbell, but the minute you put on like 2 plates on, if they cannot feel the same, right, then you know that you need to change something. That means that their default state of how they usually move might not necessarily carry over towards towards the loaded state. And I think that that's the important thing that we have to look at. And obviously, you want that to be something that you can extrapolate all the way when you're using all the way from the bar all the way to whatever maximal load they're handling. So that is probably what I would say is this, a state that the athlete feels confident, right? And can be repeatable across different intensity ranges, right? That's usually, and a lot of times it's really subjective, right? Because how athlete feel under the bar will be very different.
Right. Yeah. And like what you say about the intensity ranges is interesting because, like when you observe that something works really well up to 85%, like the classic example is deadlift, for example, right? Up to 85% moves very fast. And then you go up and you have grip issues, and you could associate that to the fact that maybe the lifter has their shoulders in front of the bar, their back is very much rounded, and so when they get above their knee, like they're not in a good position, they're not pushing, and the barbell, especially with big men or big women, rolls against the thighs, and then you have grip issues. Like in that case, would you try to fix it in terms of keep your spine more neutral, go a bit more aligned with the bar in terms of shoulder positioning, or would you like act differently here?
I think it is quite hard to tell, right? Like, is it really a positioning issue or is it like just an overall strength issue, right? So if your general strength is much higher and you can maintain that position because of your general strength, then maybe that might not be an issue, right? That doesn't mean that you have to change your position into an ideal position, because at the end of the day, adaptations would generally take place. I would probably say that there is uh that fine line that one has to tread, where essentially how much technical breakdown is permitted. And I think that there are different ways someone can look at it, but the best way to look at it would be how much deviation from the bar path one would have, because essentially anything that we look at deviation of a bar path, regardless of whatever technique they use, is essentially inefficiency, right? Which means that they need to generate more force to bring the bar back to the center, right? And I think that the more inefficiency a lifter has, the probability of the lifter failing the lift is higher, just due to requiring a greater amount of force production to basically overcome the unnecessary forces, right? So that is probably how I would look at it. If the technique allows quite things to be quite similar, then I probably wouldn't change that too much. Especially if I know that, let's just say, if this person gets slightly higher amount of training, those at this intensity range, and that resolves thing, that I probably know it's a strength thing rather than a technique thing, right? So it's also like, for example, if someone an easy way to kind of conceptualize this would be hook grip on the deadlift, right? So let's just say someone's like can hook grip 300 and like 300 kilos, and anything above that they start using straps, and their 1 rep max is 370. But when they go on the bar, and then when they pull on the hook grip, right, they might not be able to withstand like the pain of just hooking 350, even though their strength is 370, right? So that is an example where if you potentially practice hook grip at a slightly higher intensity range, gradually over time, obviously, because there's probably a reason why they don't hook grip with so often at high loads, because maybe calluses tear or the thumb just gets completely bust, right? Potentially doing that would actually rectify the issue, So obviously, general strength is not the problem, but the strength of your thumb is limited by the pain that you can hold on to, right? So that is an example of like, cool, that there isn't like much. I wouldn't say like, oh, your hook grip fail now, I would change it to mixed grip, right? Because I said the fact of the matter is I don't know if your hook grip is failing because you're not having enough exposure to that intensity range with that specific technique. So I wouldn't immediately change your technique.
Of course. And overall, do you think it would be a good goal to train with the goal of making technique efficient, even at 100%, with every movement that looks exactly the same, like every rep is exactly the same? Do you think that's a good goal, or do you think that it hides certain traps along the way?
I think that if you put that as the goal, then it isn't really I think it's kind of like putting the cart before the horse, right? I think you can get good technique with lighter loads, but then as load increases, you have to determine what is an acceptable amount of technical deviation that one can have, right? The most important thing is that you are hitting competition standards. That's always the first thing, regardless of load, and then the next bit would be let's see how much your technique decline, right, from repetition to repetition. Let's say you're doing a set of 6, right? You could potentially maintain this intensity. Let's say it's 3 sets of 6, right? Sorry, a set of 6 at 75%. Maybe up to 4th rep, your technique is good, and then we notice that rep 5 and 6, you have some technical breakdown. I think that tells us information, right? Rather than saying that, oh, my goal is to like make sure you have no technical breakdown. Because I think that the thing with perfection is that, like, if something is perfect, it doesn't really give you an opportunity to evaluate what's wrong, because by definition, perfection has no mistakes, right? So if you are only seeking perfection all the time, that kind of eliminates the troubleshooting process. So I think that while having an idea in your head of what may potentially be lacking, right? If someone deviates too far away, could be a way of pointing out what they need to work on, what are certain deficiencies, right? And then it really is down to down to experimenting if whatever change that you propose would actually contribute to a beneficial change in their technique, right? And sometimes a beneficial change in technique might not even necessarily be a beneficial change in strength, right? There might also be an element of time, right? If let's just assume that this lifter takes 20 weeks to refine their technique, but the lifter only has 16 weeks to prep, right? Is that trade-off really worth having, right? So I think that technical perfection, is shouldn't be the goal. People always say that perfection is the enemy of good. So sometimes you just need to make sure it's good enough, right? Because I think that in most cases you will not have your ideal scenario, right? So it also comes with people's prior assumptions, thinking that if you think technique is really important, then you probably want to perfect it because you think that that's the biggest contributing factor. But I think that genetics is the biggest factor, and if I could use CRISPR and freaking genetically engineer someone, I can 100% you, even if you have the crappiest technique, it will still beat like regardless. If I remove if I give you a myostatin like deficiency, you will absolutely destroy the opponent 100%. I don't care how bad your technique is, So, yeah, it's just what I think people chase goals based on their prior assumptions, and sometimes it's good to question the assumptions. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good answer. Thank you. And so then the obvious follow-up is certain people have the same, let's say, stance about programming. That is, certain people like to follow a more top-down approach to programming. That is, I have an idea, I have training, I have a background about how this plan for my athlete should look like. Other people, and of course, I'm talking about the extremes only, but there's a spectrum, right? Other people tend to stay closer to the other extreme. That is, it's not about the plan. It's not that we should come on with assumptions. It's more that we should be looking at the feedback from the athlete and be able to interpret that. And then based on the signals that emerge, right, we should build sort of like a short-term plan. And then things could change again based on the feedback that emerges and so on, right? So what's your stance here?
I think that obviously we are trying to like isolate, like paint two extremes, right? But personally, I don't actually think that there's such thing as I think it's like a false dilemma, because I don't think that there is something that's completely top down versus something that's completely bottoms up, right? Because like a complete bottom up approach, it's like it's like chaos and you just let something emerge. But to say that something is, if you are having a bottom up approach, that is already a principle to start with. Your principle is I let something emerge on its own, right? So there isn't something that there's no vacuum. You always start with some assumption. You already say that this is my principle, which I think that a bottom up approach is probably better. Therefore, I'm allowing this to happen. Personally, I think that I would say that having every coaching system starts with some assumptions or some hypothesis. Like I would probably say that I self-identify as or lean heavily Bayesian, right? So I start with certain priors that I have, right? So I have certain priors, right? That okay, cool. For the most part, this is something that will generally work, and then I have certain hypotheses, which is probably like the change that I would implement. And then based on that, I just update my priors, So I think that is probably the best way to go about things, because you cannot just have chaos and then let something think that something would work. Because what you are trying to do as a coach, at least, is come to the strongest element of, or the closest you can find, you can be to a causal mechanism, right? And which means that if you want to identify certain causal mechanisms, you need to isolate certain variables to actually identify that as a point. If you have something that is completely like chaotic, you will not be able to identify that, right? So I think that having certain priors, right, and hypothesis, right, and then you, based on the current principles, right, and then you update those beliefs with the actual data that emerge, right? Once you put that in, right, then that would be that would be how I approach things. I think that people often nowadays as well, like people always say, oh, like I base my stance on the data, right? So like let's just say the data is whatever that emerges out of the thing. But the fact of the matter is that the way you evaluate that data, right, is already inbuilt with a certain theory that's inbuilt, right? So what I think is that you can refine your theory, right? First, that makes it something that is uh, generally applicable, and then over time, for that particular the lift individual that you work with, you would see that, okay, cool, how much does this lifter deviate away from my theory, and then you just update your priors based on that. That's just, I think that is the best way to do things, rather than say, oh, I have to use this approach, right? Everything has to be, I have to shove this down your throat, right? Or versus that, oh, everything is chaos, and then hopefully a pattern would emerge out of thin air, right? So I don't think it should be one or the other. But I do think that it is very important to essentially update your beliefs. And a good way to kind of conceptualize this is, I can say that I can have 10 lifters start working with me at the same time, and I have zero issues giving them the same program on the first week. But how they progress for week 2 and week 3, that's when the divergence happens, because everybody will start in like responding differently. And by the time week 16, right, they might all look their programs, right? Obviously, there's going to be some intersection, because powerlifting's squat, bench, deadlift, is, you cannot reinvent the wheel. You can only reinvent the wheel so many times. But after that 16 weeks, their program can look very distinct from one another, even though they came from the same starting point, right? So I think that is just the best way to do things. Obviously, like I said, this is my bias, right? I think that when it comes to practice, right, that is the way to do. The Bayesian way. The Bayesian way is the way to go. So that's where my bias lies.
Yeah. So there are two situations that came to mind while you were talking. The first one is an example that Mike T, gave about Brett Gibbs. Like, he was saying that his deadlift training, for example, whereas let's say the usual interpretation of periodization says you should do, more volume at lower intensity, and then as you approach the competition, generally the intensity goes up and the volume goes down. Mike T was saying that they found out that with Brett, for whatever reason, it looked like doing the opposite was better. That is, first higher intensity, lower volume, then before competition, you increase the volume and you lower the intensity. So, what's your interpretation of this situation?
I think it's an interesting fact as well, because using the deadlift in general is I'm not, once again, this is not trying to disrespect Mike T, because I have immense respect for Mike T. And in fact, if I were to choose a coach in powerlifting, right, I would probably say Mike T influenced my thoughts a lot, especially my initial stages. But I think that using a deadlift is a poor example, because the deadlift is a lower body lift, and that means that it also interacts with the squat, right? I also think that the deadlift is probably the lift that requires the least amount of specific training to improve, because generally it is the lift where you just have to maintain positioning and generate force into the ground, right? Compare that to the squat. I say this, right? I tell this to people I coach. I said that before you start to pull the slack out from the bar, a 70 kilo deadlift and a 300 kilo deadlift will feel the same when you grab the bar before you exert any force. Because the fact of the matter is, the bar is balanced by the floor, right? So you don't have to balance the weight. Whereas for the squat, you have to balance the bar on your back. And in your bench, you have to, unrack the bar, right? Whereas the deadlift, you just have to maintain your position and exert force into the ground, right? So it's also not really surprising, because Brad Gibbs is a really good squatter, right? So, before obviously the rise of like Russ in the 83 kilo class, Brad Gibbs was like, really good at squats, right? And it is also no doubt that if you are good at squats, it is likely you have a combination of lesser range of motion, or at whether it's up and down or deviation front and back, meaning you can squat more upright, right? Which means that you are able to sustain higher amount of training stimulus, and probably recover better from it, because you're just more efficient, right? So if you look at it from that perspective, right, maybe potentially training the squat and the deadlift at higher intensity at the same time is just intersecting too much that it impacts things. But for someone who's really efficient at squatting, if you train with enough stimulus to your legs, right? Maybe if you push your intensity before, you already build that familiarity of, what is like 330 feels in my hand. I know my position. And then if you do just enough to maintain that positioning skill, and then you push your squats, right? Potentially your deadlift will feel better, right? So I think that it's very tricky when it comes to lower body lifts because, like I said, there's always the squat element you have to balance as well.
That's a very good answer. And, it goes back nicely to a lot of ideas that have been exposed to in Italy. Like this idea in Italy sometimes gets taken to, I wouldn't say the extreme, but it becomes one of the top-down assumptions. That is, exactly because of what you're saying, as a general assumption with most people, you should push the squat more. And in the last block, the intensity of the deadlifts shouldn't be as high. It should be lower because anyway, you're relying on the squat and it's just a matter of technique. And so with deadlift, you simply need to not make a mess with technique and keep it clean. And then that's it. Because the training, the stimulus comes from the squat. So I don't know what you think about this as an assumption that becomes top down, or no, wait, it's more of something that can be true in certain times, but I wouldn't generalize that.
I think it also depends on how the lifter is built, right? So that there might be certain limiting factors as well because Brad Gibbs is a conventional deadlifter. So it could potentially be if he just pushed the intensity for the squat and the deadlift at the same time, he just cooks his back so hard that he cannot do it either, And remember that powerlifting is a 3-lift sport, and the lift that contributes the most to your total is your squat and your deadlift, right? So, potentially not pushing the deadlift so hard while pushing the squat allows his back to be fresher. Would that be different if he does a sumo, if it's a sumo lifter? I have no idea, right? Then you also run into the issue of balancing loading on specific muscle groups, right? If you are a very narrow stance, squatter, a lot of knee flexion, you might be using more quads, right? Then it could potentially be beneficial to maybe this doesn't really carry over as much to your conventional deadlift, because especially if you're like a more like rounded back puller. So Brad Gibbs is not already as rounded because his arms are quite short. That's why he bench quite a lot as well, right? So he probably use more legs. But if you have longer arms, you might be relying a little bit more on your back because you can get away with less. You don't have to bend down so low, so you don't have to engage your legs as much, right? So I think that how I look at it is that how does a specific lift load a specific muscle group, and how does that muscle group interact with the other lifts? So essentially that is how I would tease that out, right? It really is about putting certain sort of like elements to isolate and then see potentially drawing out the causal mechanisms. So that's how I would tease out the differences.
Sounds good. And the second idea that came to mind while you were talking, there's like a very popular coach that I was talking to. I won't make his name because it wasn't a public public stance, unlike the one of Mike T. But he was saying something that I'd like to have your input on. He was saying that ideally, when it comes back to the idea of top down versus bottom up, his perfect scenario would be he's he's living in a place where he's got his athlete that basically trains every day. There's no program, there's no plan. Based on how he sees the athlete, that they decide to do certain things rather than others, based on, let's say, the eye of the coach, based on the intuition of the coach, based on how they see the athlete move, based on how the athlete is feeling, and so on. What do you think about this? Because I think, it's quite the opposite of having a plan, thinking about how to improve the plan continuously. It's more like I mean, my plan is my intuition, basically. So can we say it's a plan?
I think it works if you really know the lifter well. But the whole reason for having a plan or hypothesis is acknowledging the fallibility of intuitions. You know, I think that that is the most important thing to keep in mind, is that how reliable are your intuitions? Because like the scientific method is essentially developed because we certain people, right, acknowledge that there is fallibility in our intuitions, you know, and therefore we need empirical means to test and retest. Because we can see that, let's just say if this coach didn't sleep well the night before and he's hungry, the way he perceived the deviations given the same scenario will be very different compared to if he's well fed and feeling good, you know. And let's just say if you're evaluating someone's speed in real time, you're trying to say, okay, cool, my eyes are looking at the speed, right? But what if I did not sleep well and my perception of speed is skewed because of that? What if I didn't sleep well and when the person was squatting, I was yawning and then I missed? Like, it really depends on how reliable you think your intuitions are, you know? And so it might work for one lifter, and if you train that lifter specifically, it might work. But the fact of the matter is that if you train 10 lifters, how you perceive the first lifter would impact how you see the second lifter and the third lifter and so on, right? If you look at someone squatting really, really fast at the start, and then you see someone who squats a little bit slower than the first person, you think this person is squatting slow. But the fact of the matter is that that's not the case. The only reason why you think that way is because this person is squatting really fast. But if you just put the same person, but then again you place someone who's squatting slowly, right? And then you look at the same person, you might think that that person is squatting fast, even though this person is literally squatting at the same speed, right? Because your intuition would probably tell you that. And this is only three individuals, right? A slow squatter, a fast squatter, and a moderate squatter. Now you have 10 people, right? How are you going to say that my intuition would be infallible across all 10 lifters? And the fact of the matter is that we have tools to help us, because we know that memory fails, intuition fails, and all that fails. And that is kind of like the basis of like the empirical scientific method, right? Is the lack of trust in our intuitions. So I would probably say that if this coach has a high degree of confidence in his or her intuitions, by all means, go ahead. You know, and I don't know if this coach is Italian, but if you all drink a lot of wine in Italy, if you have high levels of intuition, let's have a bottle of wine together, and then I coach a lifter with my plan while I'm drunk. You coach your lifter with your plan while you're drunk. We see which lifter like turns out better, and it's a higher probability that my lifter will probably be better if I coach all the sessions with my lifter with me being drunk versus you being drunk, right? So that shows that there is some merit to that, because obviously with alcohol, you know, it creates that inhibition and your intuitions will fail. So I hope that kind of like yeah, I hope that illustrates my idea well about how I feel about intuitions.
Yeah, that's a great answer for sure. I agree with that, actually. I agree. I think it can ideally work as long as certain assumptions are respected, but the fact is those assumptions are pretty difficult to respect, you know, continuously, because of the fact that, you know, humans are not robots, right? So I agree with that. And so let's, you know, move a little bit to a specific aspect of programming. That is, it goes back to our first question about, you know, those 6 variables. When it comes to an athlete, let's say, you know, from now on, with, let's say, Emil, right? You can only track one variable. And, you know, it could be anything. It could be one variable about programming, or one variable about, you know, it could be, you know, watching his videos. It could be whatever, anything else. But you can only track that one. What would you say?
I would probably say, uh, are you look? Sorry, just to rephrase the question. We're talking about a variable. You're saying a variable that I think that if I track would contribute the most
It, it,
to like
yeah,
the training process.
exactly. Basically, a variable that you need to take a look at to evaluate whether the plan is going well or not.
I would probably just look at maybe velocities at roughly 70% intensity range during warm-ups, 65 to 70%. That's the variable I will check. Uh, you know, uh, yeah, that's probably the variable that I think is the most important, because by then you should be able to tell the readiness of the state of the lifter, by then, provided that the warm up is sufficient, because I think powerlifters are absolutely atrocious at warming up properly. So if all things being equal, I think that 65 to 70% intensity range, the speed, the the yeah the velocities would give us the most useful indicator on how the day would go.
Interesting. I did not foresee that. And what if it's only about programming? That is, and it could be also a variable that right now we don't know exactly how to calculate yet. For example, back to what we were discussing in Sheffield, the way you spread those across the weeks, for example, right? It could also be a variable like that we don't know how to calculate yet, or it could be average intensity, or it could be tonnage. Which metric would you choose?
I would like to look at intra and interset fatigue. So basically, velocity loss from each repetition, and then velocity loss from each set, right? So using that as a proxy for fatigue, that would be very important to me. However, you run into the problem of the only problem I haven't really figured out is how do you quantify singles? Because there's no velocity loss in a single, right? Because it's just one rep. So that's why so that is the I don't know part. So whoever listens to this and maybe have some bright ideas, or maybe even you have some ideas to think about that, then that will solve it will solve the problem that I'm facing. But yeah, intra and intercept velocity loss, because I think all things being equal, once again, we have to always add the caveat, right? Velocity loss is a proxy for fatigue, right? So if you are moving the bar with maximal intent, right, for each repetition, and technical proficiency is maintained, then the only variable that could probably cause velocity loss is either device malfunction or fatigue. But if your device is accurate and reliable, then it's probably fatigue, right? So I think that is probably the most important variable, because I think that the ability to push the lifter to generate high quality work is determined on how much you can do while keeping what is the amount of stimulus you can get while keeping fatigue within a certain range. And obviously that range would expand over time as you adapt towards training, right? I'm not saying that, because you can only tolerate X amount of fatigue, this will be your baseline forever.
Yeah, that's interesting. So first, I think that regarding to the single problem, probably what I would start with is, if you think about it, like also when we do 5, 6, 3 reps, the first rep, you could isolate that as a single. And I think my first question would be, given that first rep, what if we mask what if we train a neural net to learn how to predict the decay in velocity in the second, third, fourth, and so on reps? And then what if we mask, right, the velocity of the second, third, and fourth, and see whether the neural net becomes kind of accurate at predicting how fatigue decays given the first rep? right? Then, of course, you could go up with intensity, and you could do that, you know, with higher intensities, because of course the way it decays at 70% is not the way it decays at 90%, right? But I think that, I'm not saying this will be a solution. I think it will be an interesting question, at least, to explore the problem in the first stages.
Yeah. So just to kind of like frame it differently. So you would say that basically a double, right, at RPE 7, right, is basically a single at RPE 6, right?
Yes,
So
exactly. You know that, exactly.
yeah, right. I mean, people might not think it's the same thing, right? But if you basically -1 is the same thing. So what you're based on what I'm hearing, correct me if I'm wrong. Let's just say we are doing a single at 6, right? So if we have a prediction model of we collect information, obviously, then what we can do is we can say that if the prediction model is accurate, the fatigue generated would be an assumption based on if you do a a double. So if you do a single at 6, right, it would be the decay from RP5 to RP6 in between. So let's just say you're doing 2 reps. So you're creating an assumption based on that, and that's how you quantify the single.
Exactly. That's the thing. Because like with that same load, now you're doing a single. But, in the past weeks, maybe you've done 2, 3, 4 reps, whatever. So now it's a single, but you have data about what happens when you don't do a single with that weight and you do something else, right? So, of course, again, at 95%, you don't know what's going to happen with 5 reps because it's simply not feasible, right? So the data gets limited there. But, you can still, I think, probably learn something meaningful there. So it will be interesting to explore that.
Yeah, I liked
Yeah.
it. I actually really like that solution. The funny thing is that I've always thought about it from this perspective where, a single at 7 is a double at RP6. No, wait, a double at 7 is a single at RP6. Yeah. But I didn't think about quantifying the decay based on that projection, right? So let's just say if you get the decay from a double, right? Let's just a double at 7, right? That decay would mean that would be your single at 6. It's the same thing, right? It's essentially yeah, like I said, that is a way to go about things, and obviously it has to be tested, so yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting to explore. I think kind of solves the problem ish. If the assumptions hold true.
Yeah. And so since we're talking about, RPE velocity, percentages as well, like, we have a range of tools available, right? So we can prescribe training in multiple ways, because you could go about percentages, you could use RPE, you could use a range of percentages with an RPE, you could use velocity. It looks like you have an inclination towards velocity. What do you think about it?
Yeah, I'm very big on velocity, right? Obviously, the only thing we have now are like accelerometers and linear position transducers. I do think that velocities would it's better in quantifying things. First of all, let me caveat this by I say that as a coach, it's beneficial for a coach to use velocities. I'm not necessarily saying that a velocity-based training program given in isolation to an athlete is actually better. So I'm saying that I don't think that there are any studies out there that so far does velocity-based training program is saying that if a velocity-based training program produce better results should be taken with a hint of skepticism, because what you do in a control experiment is that you get someone to do a velocity-based training program, right? And let's just say other groups does RP based RP or whatever, right? It is likely that the velocity-based training program would be something that is novel to the lifter, which means that what you're doing is you're saying that a guided velocity-based training program is better than an RP-based program. But if you actually say, let's just do velocity-based training program without any guidance, it might be not, like I say, I don't know. I'm agnostic about this because there's no data, but the lifter might actually be worse, because I have worked with lifters who say, oh, I just hate tracking, I just what am I gonna do if this doesn't track like 1 rep? What am I gonna? How am I gonna spend more time troubleshooting my device than freaking lifting? There are lifters like that. So the fact of the matter is that I'm not saying that velocity-based training is better. I'm just saying that velocity is an extremely useful tool for the coach because it provides valuable data for the coach to interpret, right? Rather than this is RP6, like, yeah, cool. What does it tell? How does it like it doesn't really tell me much except that this is how you feel on that day, and your RP, so I think that that's where I lean towards. I'm very bullish on velocity based data, right? Using that specifically data, not interchangeable with training per se, because I don't necessarily think that if someone given a velocity like without proper guidance would benefit more from velocity based training compared to something that they are used to. The difference may be marginal, but you might not even rephrase that. The difference you might gain from training velocity might be marginal if you use it well, but if you don't use it well, it might actually be lower. So that's where I stand on that.
I see what you're saying, and so when you talk about inter and intra velocity decay of sorry, inter and intra set decay of velocity, it looks like that's a metric that you look at. And one question that I would have is, throughout the course of let's say the 12 weeks before a competition, how would you like to see these inter and intraset decay of velocity evolve? That is, do you want to see a lot of decay in the early weeks, and then as soon as you approach competition, it starts being less salient as a decay? Do you have an exact pattern in mind that you try to use to guide the training of the athlete?
So I think it's a very interesting question, and it was kind of like a shame that one of my professional like colleagues, right? I don't directly work with this person, but we know each other through exercise science research. They basically his research group based in Sheffield actually did a study where they looked at essentially high frequency lifting when they are trying to quantify what overtraining really is, right? So and then they look at different tapering strategies, and what they found was that after a period of quote unquote overreaching, right? A typical taper of, let's just say, a 5-day taper resulted in a 5% increase. But when they extended the taper to like slightly longer to 10 days, they saw like a 7% increase. So a slightly longer taper after a period of overreaching increased maximum strength to a greater degree. Don't quote me on the 5 to 7, right? I don't actually know what the exact percentage is. But what that shows is that it shows that given a specific training dose / stimulus, tapering strategies should be different. And I said it's a shame because what we didn't really quantify is that we don't really know what overreaching is, right? So let's just say if we go into a training, right, and we do warm-ups and your readiness is predicted by, let's just say, each intensity range, right? 20, 30, 40, 50, 50 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, right? Your warm-ups, this is your velocities. Maybe at a state of overreaching, right, is when you have to put an arbitrary cutoff point, and then you test whether that hypothesis holds true. But let's just say a drop in 20% of your warm-ups drop by 20%, then that is a state of overreaching. And then in that state of overreaching, how long does it take for you to get back to that ready state again, right? So like the fact of the matter is that we don't know because they didn't collect that data. So I was like, damn it, I wish I could find out, because then we truly know that how much we can push a lifter, right? And then after pushing this lifter this hard, how much we have to taper, right? To restore that performance. So essentially, we always have to look at it from the perspective of the fatigue generated would accumulate over time, but the time required to dissipate that fatigue might vary, right? Depending on how much fatigue you accumulate. So in terms of that, that's how I would want to look at velocity, right? Is that after a while, you know, there will be a dip, and then how long does it take before that dip rises again? Uh, so that's how I would look at it.
Yeah. Yeah. And also, I think there's like, the difficulty lies in the fact that, say, you've got a competition in 2 weeks. I mean, one of your athletes has a competition in 2 weeks, right? And so this session 2 weeks earlier was pretty bad in terms of the K. Like, it looks like they've got a lot of fatigue. But then, my question is, at that point, could it be that there's other factors as well? Like, they didn't sleep well. Other, random factors as well, like psychology, the way they, showed up, at the gym. So is it good that you intervene and you're like, okay, there's too much fatigue, let's taper a bit earlier? Or should you let it go? And probably, the answer is, I mean, I'll be interested in knowing what you think about this, but my take is we don't know yet, probably. There's a component of chance as well.
Yeah. So I think that everything when it comes to training is about consistency and the repeatability, right? And that is on the positive side, right? And on the negative side as well. If you are stronger, it means that you are able to repeat X amount of sets, right, across multiple reps, right? So you can say that you're stronger, right? On the flip side, if you look at it from that perspective, we would have to say that if you consistently have the 3 bad sessions in a row, right, all keeping things equal, right, then it might be the case that uh you are already you might reach a phase of overreaching, right? It has to be something that is either consistently bad or also consistently going down, right, on a decline, right? You have to, like I said, you have to isolate variables as well, because like I said, sleep matters. If you have mental fatigue from work, that matters as well. So communication with the specific lifter that you work with would be helpful. So even like when I use like velocity based training, uh, when I set cutoff points, right, on when to terminate the set, I usually would tell a lifter. I mean, it's very rare that a lifter would do this because most of them can't train like that anyway. But for myself, right, because even though I'm not that strong, I like to just look at the numbers for fun. Basically, if I if my rep drop below a cutoff point, right, I will not terminate the set unless my next rep is also below the cutoff point, right? Because there's also an element of chance, right? So it is more likely that uh an element of chance, so the element of chance is reduced if it's repeated across time, right? Or repeated across reps. So that's how I would do it, how I would terminate a set if it meets a certain velocity threshold. And then if we just uh magnify that into the session, right? If the velocities for all your intensity ranges starts dropping on this one, and it starts dropping, and on the next time your squatting is the same, right? It is likelihood that it's probably not chance, then that is a signal for you to then make a decision.
Yeah, and this makes me think about the stories that you posted on Instagram like a few days ago about um, when you take training seriously, there are certain sessions where you have to dig deep into yourself and find a way to close the session and go through it, even though it doesn't look like it's gonna be easy, and it's not, right? So do you think that what do you think about this in relation to auto-regulation? That is, when should you push regardless of how you feel, and when it might be wiser to not push and call it a day?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. I think a little bit of a backdrop to that story. I'm not trying to is so that was the day I went to the gym on Tuesday. And for those, I mean, most people don't know because I don't really like. I mean, I posted once or twice on my story, but like almost 2 years ago, I had an ACL surgery. And after my ACL surgery, I wasn't really training that hard, right? But I decided to start training harder again, and basically just the whole post was saying like the benefit of actually like training. Is the cliche of like training versus working out, right? So I like what happened was that I started training again. I've just started like cool. I think squatting is generally beneficial. For most things, right? Just having strong legs. Even if I want to play sports, having strong legs is beneficial. So I just do high bar squats. I don't wear knee sleeves, also because like I have like some tingling sensations whenever like my surgery wound is like touched by anything. So the knee sleeves actually just basically puts my left leg in a tingle the whole time, which is a strange feeling. So I just do high bar squats, right? And I started doing this only after the IPF course the level 2 IPF course last year in October, because we had a group training session, and I think that this is also a benefit of a team environment. It's like we train in a group, and then I feel like I want to push myself a bit more. So I was like, okay, cool. Like now I actually feel like a small urge of actually like not squatting 70 kilos for the rest of my life, right? So I started training, and then before Christmas, because I went on a break for Christmas, at that point, I just maxed out my squat, and I did 150, right, on a high bar squat, right? So without any knee sleeves, right? For context, my best squat I think in competition is 207.5 with a low bar, right? Full like knee sleeves, knee sleeve belt, and a Titan singlet, right? Which probably adds 2.5 kilos if you wear the proper Titan singlets. If you know, you know. But so that day I did 150, right? And that was right before the new year. Fast forward to this week where I was training, and it was actually my deload week. So I've been pushing myself for 4 weeks, right? So I just like basically just start to have deloads as well, because then sometimes when you have deloads, before that it gives you reasons to push yourself a bit. So this was my deload week, and typically, deload week, it's there are multiple ways to deload, right? You can reduce volume, reduce intensity, but what I did was I actually wanted to see how my training was. So I wanted to push my squat, right? But I decided I'm going to cut the volume back. So I only did one back offset, right? Essentially. So, but my training was on a Tuesday, and Monday is the biggest work day for me, where I do all my athlete check-ins, and which means I have a lot of like work stress the day before, and then I sleep quite late, right? Because I tend to work slightly later, and then on that day in the morning, right? At 7 a.m., I had this like the craziest like stomach cramps, right? I just feel like my stomach's like just cramping from the inside. And I've never really have stomach issues, right? I was like I said, I was born and raised in Malaysia. And in Asia, if you can eat the Asian food, right? The street food, your stomach is probably like made of like steel, right? So I really never have stomach issues. But that day, I essentially had like this cramp for 2 hours, and I couldn't even like go to the bathroom because standing up hurts. And I was like, man, my sleep was horrible, right? Because I generally wake up around like 9 to 10, which means that waking up after a big work day, you wake up 3 hours earlier because of your stomach cramp. And I just went to the gym, and then I was having a conversation with one of my lifters prior, and I was just like, man, like, I just thought to myself, like, all the lifters that I coach, they go to training for a reason, right? Right. And then like I just like asked myself, what does training actually mean to me? It might sound a bit cliched, and I like just decided to push myself, and I did 150 for a double, right? Which means I doubled my all-time best, right? Compared to last year on like the worst situation, the least ideal circumstance. Obviously, right? It's not my best because, like I said, my strength levels are probably higher because I've squatted way more than that, right? But what the idea of that is just saying that sometimes, and I think that auto-regulation is a good tool, but blind auto-regulation is not useful, because the minute you have to auto-regulate down, you should ask yourself, why do I have to auto-regulate this down? It should send a signal on like, am I sleeping well? Am I eating well? Is there something going on? Sometimes there might not be a reason, but sometimes that signal, like if you know that roughly your intensity, if you do a single at your intensity range of 75 to 85%, right, is roughly 6.5 to 7 RPE, right? If you have to if you have to auto-regulate down to like by 5 to 10%, then you can do it. But that blind auto-regulation is like, oh, every time I go in, I just lower the load, but you don't question yourself, right? Why that is the case, right? I think that that's not helpful, right? Digging deep doesn't mean just like hyping yourself up, but actually like digging deep and reflecting on what is causing that environment. And for some people, it might be too much, paralysis by analysis. But if you have a coach, your coach will ask you, hey, is there anything happening around this situation? And then you can dig deeper into that issue. So I guess digging deep is like it has two meanings as well. Not just digging itself, digging deep for motivation, but also reflecting on certain circumstances that doesn't, if you're not hitting what you're supposed to hit, right? Why is that the case? So that's kind of how I view autoregulation. I think it's a useful tool, but just like how velocity is a signal, I think autoregulation too is a signal, right? So if you consistently have to lower your loads at the same RPE, then you should probably start asking why that is the case, and not just say, oh, autoregulation will fix everything because as long as I stick to the RPE, everything is fine.
Yeah, that's a very good answer, and I think it connects nicely to to my question. That is, in your experience, what do you have to say about injury risk? What is something that you see and you believe is significant when it comes to injury risk?
Yeah, I think that is a very, very interesting question. I think the problem with injury risk is that we first have to define what injury is. Uh, you know, uh, and there might be different ways to kind of piece what an injury really is. So people may have different definitions, but without getting too bogged up in definitions and telling people which definition they should adopt, because obviously people can adopt a different definition if they want, and then it may not necessarily apply. How I look at injury is from this perspective, right? I said that I look at it from the perspective that was there an event that led the athlete to a severe reduction or cessation of training, right? So let's just assume that you have lifter A and this lifter couldn't train for a week, right? And the reason why is unknown. So the only data point you have is that lifter A supposed to train on Monday, right? But the next time this lifter trained was actually next Monday instead of this week. So that's the only thing you know about this situation, right? And then from there, what I do is that now I unpack it a little bit more, right? Then I try to isolate what is the element that caused it. Because if you think about it, right, someone can have a reduced like functional thing from pain, right? So I say pain specifically because pain does not necessarily mean injury, right? So during the pain, they have to reduce training for 1 week. Or they could be really sick and they probably shouldn't go to the gym and infect anybody with their germs. And they probably, if they can't walk, they could be sick. Or they could be having a vacation in the jungle, right, for 1 week and they have no gym unless they decide to carry some logs, right? You can input all of these three potential scenarios, right? And the outcome will still be the same. Lifter A did not train for 1 week because of sickness, pain, or vacation in the jungle. So now that we have these three examples, then when I look at that, I say that, cool. Now that this happened, right, what is the next step that I have to take for them to get back to training, right? Because unless you're giving up on training, right, the goal is always to train to start training again, right? So the approach would be, if this person actually was having a vacation in the jungle, how would I ease this person back into training? If this person was sick, how do I ease this person back into training? If this person has some pain, would I ease this person back into training, right? And obviously those elements that you ease them back into would vary based on the circumstances. So I don't necessarily look at it from like injury, right? Because I also think that the nocebo effect can be quite strong. If you say someone is injured, they might catastrophize things. I'm saying that, okay, cool, you require a cessation or reduction from training. How great is that cessation and reduction in training? And what can we do to get you back to it, right? And then that is essentially how I look at it. And a big caveat is that, provided that this is something that's not like a clear structural thing, like this person actually like have a bone sticking out from their hand, like obviously I'm not going to say, oh, you're not injured. Like clearly if you have a bone sticking out from your hand, I think, that's a completely different case, right? So let's just exclude all extreme cases where you actually have broken like structures in your body. So I look at it from that perspective, is that what is the functional element that is lacking from the event that caused a reduction and cessation of training, right? And then how can I restore that functional element, I think that is the way I approach things, rather than saying, oh, you're injured, therefore we need to do this, right? Because I do think that if you are saying injured, right, you already have some preconceived notion of what you should do when you're injured, because you say, oh, injured, we have to rehab. But that doesn't necessarily have to be the case, because is a reduction in training load rehab? Some people will say yes, some people will say no, but like, and I don't think it's really useful, because unless you are giving up, right, the word injury doesn't really tell you much, right? But the question is, what are you going to do next? So that's the whole reason why people usually say that whether you have an MRI or not doesn't really help, because unless you are going to give up lifting based on your MRI, you still have to find a way to change things. And it is unlikely the MRI would change our approach as much, right? So it's more of like looking at what is the cessation or reduction of training, and how can I restore that functional ability again, based on what the actual event that causes cessation would be. So that's kind of like how I would look at things.
That's a very interesting way of looking at it. Yeah, pretty cool. So basically, you're saying that, I mean, it's a very pragmatic stance, and you're saying unless there's a clear trend, a clear repetition of this injury that probably points at something structural that needs to be fixed. In some cases, it's just going to be whatever. Let's ease back into training, and and exactly like the vacation situation, for example. So that's pretty interesting. Pretty cool.
Yeah, I think it's also, like I say, I'm not a physio, right? I don't really have that mindset of like a physiotherapy mindset. So this is how I approach things as a coach, right? So I come from that coaching perspective, and it really is all about saying that. So I think another very clear example is this, right? So to make it a little bit clearer on the difference between someone having a vacation and not training, the likely thing that would cause a person to have to stop someone from training after a vacation is DOMS, right? So they lose the repeated bout effect. They didn't train. The minute you put them freaking squat, their adduct, especially if they're really hip dominant, right? Their freaking adductors are gonna like kill them. So that is probably gonna cause like issues, right? So how are you gonna restore that functional capacity again, right? So you probably want to ease into things, maybe not lose like high volumes, higher repetition set close to failure, maybe do like slightly lower work, especially for the first few sessions. So that's an example. Whereas if you have someone who is uh let's say like actually feeling pain, right, at a certain load, maybe the way you get them is exercise modification, right? Move change something up, and then and then you can restore certain functional capacity based on that. So those are two like different events, even though they didn't train, or their training was greatly reduced. So it's very like kind of like I say, practical and outcome focused. Is how I can theorize about the mechanisms all I want, but until today, most pain scientists will tell you that pain is so complex, right? Especially when the psychological element, like the biopsychosocial model, right, is so complex. It makes things more complex, right? I think that conversations, people use biopsychosocial model, and it's very funny because it's meant to sort of like explicate the complexity of pain. But then you have one camp that says, oh, it's all biomechanics. But then you, on the flip side, say, oh, it's all in your head. I'm like, that is literally not the point of the biopsychosocial model. The biopsychosocial model is saying that people are simplifying things to one element, but now you're just simplifying things completely the opposite. You say, oh, all the pain is all in your head, So I think that due to the complexity of issues and the lack of expertise that I have, the lack of expertise, that on my end, I'm really just focused on the outcome, right? How can I move the needle to a more positive outcome?
That's a very interesting answer for sure. So yeah, I'm gonna record an episode with John Song as well. So I think this will be an interesting topic to bring up, because we've talked about this stuff already, but yeah, I think I think it's gonna be an interesting conversation for sure. And yeah, so let's close with this one. Which question do you wish someone would ask you in an interview that nobody ever does?
Wow, it's quite pretty. It's funny because I actually thought about this question, and it's really hard for me because people always say that you don't know what you don't know, you know. So I don't know. I would probably say something like really like esoteric, like you know, are you a Platonist or an Aristotelian, something like that, you know, like
Interesting.
something that's something that's completely unrelated, as far away from science and lifting. So,
Nice.
yeah,
And what
yeah,
would your answer be?
it's hard because I probably lean a little bit both. You know, I think that I mean, obviously, if people, for those people, I mean, actual philosophers will probably kill me, but you know, the lay person probably just think I'm just spewing like random stuff. But I think that like I tend to think that if you're an Aristotelian, you do think that there's some form of like telos or purpose in nature. So I tend to lean towards that. You know, I think that if you uh and also that's like when we do, I think that that might also be an occupational hazard because whenever you like coach, you always say like, what is the purpose of this exercise, right? So my mindset is always geared towards purpose, right? Or the purpose of your quads, right, is to bring you into this position, you know. And when we look at specific organs in our body, right, your heart has a purpose, and that's to pump blood, right? Your liver is to filter subtoxics, you know, your kidneys to regulate like urine and stuff like that. So I think that just from a perspective of being like very like focusing on this kind of like science stuff, we always say this is the purpose, right, of something, and that tend to gravitates me a little bit more towards the Aristotelian view, which is a little bit ironic because like science kind of like did pop up against pushback against like Aristotelian views back in the day because of certain let's just put it this way, religious infighting, right? Because back in the day, Catholics were very much influenced by Thomas Aquinas, and Thomas Aquinas was greatly influenced by Aristotle, whereas the Reformation from the Protestant was basically anything like not Catholic. So, and a lot of the scientists, I mean, you know, back in the day, like for example, Francis Bacon was, uh, you know, from like the more of the Protestant strain. So it's like kind of like a pushback against like the Aristotelian view. So, but that's just like a long-winded spiel of like me just throwing out thoughts in my head, which is not related to this. So forgive me, listeners, if you just wasted 3 minutes of your life listening to me ramble.
Yeah, no, I think it's actually pretty interesting. Yeah, yeah. I mean, philosophy was my favorite subject at school when I was at high school, and it was actually one of my options for a bachelor's at first. Then I opted towards cognitive science, and then I deviated again neuroscience and AI. But yeah, that's a pretty cool source for a conversation maybe in the future.
Well, I would definitely say that based on what one thing is true is that there might not be as many eternal truths in the world, but the thing that comes as close as possible is that philosophers don't make money. So so based on how the current AI boom is happening, I think that your selection has brought you into a slightly more potential for a lucrative career than rather being a philosopher. You know, so
For sure.
that is probably a good decision.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah. So thank you very much. I think it was a crazy good episode. Thank you
Pleasure's
everyone for
mine.
listening. And yeah,
Yeah.
talk to you soon.
I mean, you don't have really much people to compare it to besides Jason. So, you know, there's two of us. So hopefully there are better ones as well in the future.
Yeah, I mean, when you start so good, it gets pretty hard for the next ones, but I'm sure that, um, it's gonna be cool as well. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks for having me. Thank you all for listening. Hopefully you'll you know, gain something from my rambles. You know, I try to systemize my thoughts as much as I can. But forgive me if it was not not clearly explained.
It was super good, man. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, everyone.